Smoke poured from the clay oven before she even realized her trembling hands had left the loaves too long inside. When she pulled them free, the crusts were blackened, hard and bitter with the sharp scent of ruin. Laughter rose behind her at once. Ranch hands leaning against the doorway, their smirks sharp as knives. "So, that's the fine wife from the East," one jeered, his voice echoing across the kitchen. "Can't even keep bread from burning." Her cheeks flushed scarlet, her heart hammering against the apron tied too loosely at her waist. She clutched the tray close, as though hiding it might undo her shame. The dream of starting fresh on this ranch, of being more than a bargain sealed by letters, cracked like the loaves themselves. For a heartbeat, she wanted nothing more than to run. But before her tears could spill, a shadow filled the doorway. The mocking fell into silence. The rancher stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat low over steady eyes that carried no cruelty. He didn't look at the men. He looked only at her. Without a word, he crossed the room. He took the tray from her shaking hands and picked up the first charred crust. The room held its breath. He bit into it, chewed slowly, and swallowed. The corners of his mouth curved into a smile as warm as sunlight. "Best bread I've had all season," he said, his voice calm, but carrying to every ear in the kitchen. A ripple of shock ran through the room. The laughter died, replaced by uneasy glances. One ranch hand tried to snicker, but the sound withered under the weight of the rancher's gaze. He broke another piece and ate that too, his jaw set, his smile steady. She stared at him, wide-eyed, unable to understand. Why would a man of his stature lower himself to eat what others mocked? The burnt crusts crumbled in his strong hands, but not a flicker of distaste crossed his face. Only quiet defiance, a shield that protected her from humiliation more powerfully than any blade could. In the West, some said love was not born in poetry or promise. It was born in small mercies, in men who stood against scorn with a simple smile. Her throat tightened, her vision blurring. For the first time since arriving, she felt a sliver of safety flicker in her chest. He handed the tray back to her gently, his smile lingering. "Bake again tomorrow," he said, "and I'll eat every crust you make." But as the men slunk away, shamefaced and muttering, a cold thought pierced her. This wasn't kindness, it was a performance. She was his property, and he was simply protecting his investment from mockery. The thought was colder than the morning air, because property can be discarded when it no longer has value, and she knew her value was already measured in ash. The kitchen was empty now, the silence heavier than the earlier laughter. The rancher stood by the door, his back to her, watching the men disperse into the yard. She thought he was going to leave, to go about his day and forget the woman who couldn't even bake bread. But then he turned. His eyes found hers across the room, and the smile was gone, replaced by something she couldn't read, something harder. "Why are your hands shaking?" he asked softly. His voice was low, meant for her ears alone, and the question pierced her harder than their laughter had, because it carried no mockery, only concern. And concern was a weapon she didn't know how to defend against. She clutched the apron against her chest, her eyes darting to the oven still smoking faintly. Her lips trembled as she tried to form an answer. "Because I don't belong here," she whispered, her voice raw. The confession spilled before she could stop it. She expected him to agree, to nod and walk away, leaving her to her failure. Instead, his gaze held hers, calm and unflinching. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could feel the quiet strength radiating from him like the heat of the fire. "Belonging isn't proven in bread," he said, his tone as sure as the ground beneath their feet. "It's proven in how you rise after falling." Her throat tightened. Tears pricked her eyes because no one in her life had ever said such words. Back home, she had been measured in dowries, bargains, and whispered judgments, not in mercy. She lowered her head, ashamed. "They'll laugh again tomorrow," she said bitterly. "They'll laugh until I can't hear anything else." He reached forward then, slow and deliberate. He lifted the edge of her apron where her fists had wrinkled it, smoothing it flat with a touch so gentle it stole the air from her chest. "Let them laugh," he said. "Bread burns. It always has. But courage doesn't. A kind word at the right hour, the old tales say, weighs more than a chest of silver." and the smallest mercy can turn shame into a seed for love. She looked up, her tears shining in the glow of the fire. For the first time, she saw no judgment in his eyes, only a patience that felt as though it had been waiting for her long before she stepped through his door. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking into a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" The rancher's smile curved again, quiet but unshaken. "Because a home is built on more than bread." The words sank into her like water into parched earth. And though her cheeks still burned with shame, her heart carried a flicker of warmth that would not be extinguished. But as he turned to leave, his hand brushed a small, framed picture on the mantel. A woman with a kind smile and eyes the same color as his. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame, and a shadow crossed his face so deep and sudden it chilled the air. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He left without another word, leaving her alone with the cold bread and a chilling new question. Who was the woman in the photograph? And why did the sight of her turn his kindness to ice? She stood alone in the kitchen, the warmth of his words fighting against the cold dread that now seeped into her bones. The tray of blackened bread sat on the table, a monument to her failure. Her fingers trembled against the apron, as if the fabric itself could anchor her in this strange new life. She thought of the road she had taken, the long ride west that stole the last of her savings, the letter that promised a husband and a home, the voices of her kin saying she was better sold than starved. Every mile had carried the sting of shame. Every night under strange stars, a reminder that she had been traded like a parcel, her worth measured in signatures rather than love. Tears blurred her eyes as she remembered the man she had been promised to. A name on paper, a face she had never seen. And this rancher, this quiet, complicated man, was him. He had to be. But his kindness felt heavier than chains. Why? Why did it feel so fragile, so close to shattering? A woman can endure cruelty and remain standing. But mercy. Mercy bends the knees, because it is rarer than gold in a world built on bargains. She pressed the apron to her face, breathing in the faint scent of flour and smoke. Part of her longed to trust, to believe that his smile meant more than pity, that maybe she could begin again here. But another part, the part shaped by betrayal, warned her that trust was another word for risk, and risk had cost her everything once already. She slid down against the wall, tucking her knees to her chest, the apron clutched tight. "I will not be fooled again," she whispered fiercely. Then her eyes fell upon a small leather-bound book on a low shelf, near where he had touched the photograph. It looked like a journal. His journal. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. It was wrong. An invasion of the privacy of the man who had just defended her. But the need to understand, to unravel the knot of his kindness and his sorrow, was a desperate, burning thing. She opened it. The first page was not in his handwriting. The script was different, looser, more optimistic. It was a letter, addressed to her. "My dearest Clara," it began, her name. "By the time you read this, I will be your husband. My name is Samuel, and this ranch, this life, will be ours." Samuel. Not the name from the letters she had received. The letters were signed by a man named Elias. The rancher. Her blood ran cold. The man who ate her burnt bread, the man who had just stood before her, was not Samuel. He was not her intended husband. He was Elias, the brother. And the last entry in the journal, written in Elias's tight, grim handwriting, explained everything in 4 soul-crushing words. Samuel is dead, buried last spring. Morning spread across the ranch with a pale, unforgiving glow. It painted the corral and stretched shadows long across the packed earth, each one a finger pointing at her, the imposter. When she stepped out of the kitchen, the cool air struck her cheeks, clearing the smoke and tears, but not the ice in her veins. She was a bride to a dead man, a bargain fulfilled too late. Horses whickered in the distance, their sleek backs glinting in the rising sun. Men began their day's labor, their boots a steady rhythmic march on the dirt. A world moving on, oblivious to the fact that hers had just ended. She stood uncertain at the threshold, the apron clutched in her hand like a useless shield. Her eyes swept over a world that was not hers, a world that had never been hers. The ranch hands who had laughed at her now cast different glances, not of mockery, but of something else. Pity? Contempt? They knew. Of course they knew. They knew she had come for a ghost. Then she saw him, Elias, the rancher. He leaned against a corral rail, his broad frame calm in the morning light. And when his eyes lifted to meet hers, there was no scorn. But there was no kindness either. There was only the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had already seen her shame, and now shared in her impossible situation. Her heart stuttered, caught between fear and a new, terrible kind of grief. She wasn't just a failure. She was a burden, a loose thread in a story that was already over. She tightened her grip on the apron, whispering under her breath, "I don't know how to stand here." The frontier, it said, was not built for those who waited to be invited. It was built by those who dared to plant their feet and say, "This land will know me." But how could she plant her feet on a grave? She drew a slow breath, her shoulders straightening. She stepped off the porch, the dirt crunching beneath her shoes. Each step was an act of defiance against the urge to turn and run back east, back to the life that had cast her out. His gaze followed her, steady, unreadable. One of the men chuckled under his breath, a low, cruel sound. "Come to claim a dead man's property?" Before the words had even finished leaving the man's mouth, Elias spoke, his voice just loud enough to carry and sharp as flint. "You've had your jest. Get to work." The laughter died instantly. The air felt lighter, as though the sun itself had broken through the haze of cruelty. She paused in the middle of the yard, clutching the apron tighter, her eyes darting once more to the man at the rail. He gave the faintest nod, not a command, but an unspoken promise. "You are not alone in this." Her throat tightened, and though she could not smile yet, the weight in her chest eased just enough for her to breathe. She walked toward him, her mind racing. Why did he let her come? Why didn't he send word? Why pretend? The questions were a storm inside her, and she knew, looking at the hard line of his jaw, that the answers would be a different kind of ruin. This wasn't about her bread, it was about his brother, and the woman in the photograph. He didn't wait for her to ask. As she reached the fence line, he turned his gaze from her to the lowing cattle in the field beyond. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of a long winter. "His name was Samuel," he said. It wasn't an introduction. It was a eulogy. She clutched the apron tighter, her knuckles white. The letters. "I wrote the last few," he admitted, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. After the accident. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to stop you." He finally looked at her and she saw a deep, hollowed out guilt in his eyes. "The passage was paid. I hoped." He trailed off. "You hoped what?" she whispered, her voice brittle. "That I would arrive, see a grave, and simply turn around?" A muscle tightened in his jaw. "I hoped you'd have a place to land. A chance. Samuel. He wanted that for you." The words were meant to be kind, but they felt like stones. She was not a person to him. She was a final wish. A duty. "And the men?" she asked, the bitterness rising. "Their laughter. It wasn't just the bread, was it?" He shook his head, the morning sun catching the faint, silvery line of a scar that traced his jaw. A line of history she hadn't noticed before. "No," he said, his voice dropping lower. "It wasn't." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken tragedy. "The woman in the picture on the mantel," he said, his voice rough. "That was my wife, Eleanor. She died of fever 2 years back." He took a breath, and it sounded like it was torn from his lungs. "The last thing she tried to do, before the fever took her mind, was bake bread for me." Her breath caught. A cold, sickening dread washed over her. "She left it in the oven too long," he finished, his voice barely a whisper. "It burned, just like yours." The world tilted. The men's laughter wasn't mockery of her. It was a cruel echo of his past grief. They weren't laughing at a clumsy newcomer. They were seeing a ghost, a painful reminder of a loss that still hung over this ranch like a shroud. And her mistake, her simple, foolish mistake, had desecrated that memory. She wasn't just a burden. She was a curse. Why? She breathed, the word torn from her. Why would you eat it? In front of them? His gaze finally left the horizon and met hers, and the pain in his eyes was so raw, so deep, it nearly brought her to her knees. Because I know what it feels like to be laughed at for failing, he said. And because my brother, Samuel, he died trying to save me. The scar on his face suddenly seemed to burn with a story of its own. In every tale worth keeping, pain is not wasted. It becomes the bridge by which one soul reaches another. But this bridge was built of ghosts and ash. She stared at the scar on his jaw, a pale white line against his weathered skin. It was the key, the missing piece of the story. The accident, she whispered. He rested his hands on the rail, his knuckles white. He stared out at the grazing herd, but she knew he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing the past. A winter storm, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. A stampede. Samuel pushed me clear of a falling beam in the old barn. It took him instead. He finally looked at her, his eyes hollow. This scar is all I have left of him. A reminder of the debt I can never repay. Her breath caught, her heart twisted. She had never imagined the man who silenced mockery, the man who stood as a pillar of strength, was himself buried under a mountain of guilt. His kindness to her wasn't kindness, it was penance. He was trying to fulfill his dead brother's promise because he felt he had stolen his brother's life. You smiled through it, she whispered, thinking of the way he ate her bread. No, he replied, shaking his head again. The word was sharp, brittle. I carry it until I break. The land nearly broke me too. But I learned there's strength in standing with someone when the world sneers. Samuel taught me that. He paused. That's why I ate your bread. It was for him. For him, not for her. The words hung between them, heavier than silence. She pressed the apron against her chest, her tears hot and unbidden. For the first time since leaving her home, she felt her shame lighten, only to be replaced by an even heavier weight. She was a living symbol of his failure, a constant reminder of the brother he couldn't save. I thought I was the only one, she whispered, her voice trembling. His gaze shifted back to her, steady and unyielding. You're not. What he had given her wasn't pity. It was a shared prison. The mercy of being understood, yes, but understood as two broken pieces of a life that belonged to someone else. She turned away, unable to bear the weight in his eyes. She saw a bucket of water near the porch, meant for the trough. An excuse. Something to do. Something other than stand here and drown in his grief. She picked it up. It was heavy, heavier than she expected. She stumbled toward the corral, the weight of the water and his story pulling at her arms. Water sloshed over the rim, dark patches staining the dirt and the hem of her dress. She bit back a cry of frustration, determined not to falter while he walked just ahead. He lifted a heavy gate with one arm, the wood creaking. He gestured for her to bring the bucket through. She hurried, nearly tripping on a stone, but his hand shot out, steadying her elbow before she could fall. Easy, he said, his voice calm. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through her. It wasn't the touch of a man performing a duty. It was instinct. It was real. And that was somehow worse. She set the bucket down hard, water spilling again. She groaned softly. I can't even carry what you lift like nothing. His mouth curved faintly, but it wasn't humor. It was a sad, tired acknowledgement. Strength isn't measured in buckets, he replied, taking the handle and tipping it gently into the trough. It's measured in showing up again tomorrow. She watched him, her chest tight with a feeling she could not name. It was a dangerous mix of gratitude, sorrow, and something else. Something that felt terrifyingly like hope. One of the ranch hands passed by, the same one who had jeered the loudest. He smirked at her clumsiness. Elias's voice carried, sharp as a whip crack. Get to work! The man lowered his head and hurried off, leaving them in the soft haze of dust and sunlight. She bent to gather another bucket, her arms aching, but when she straightened, she found his gaze steady on her. He wasn't measuring her failure. He was measuring the fire in her eyes as she refused to stop. You don't have to prove yourself to me, he said gently. She froze, her lips parting with words she could not form. The implication was clear. She didn't have to prove herself because she didn't matter. Her efforts were meaningless. She was just a ghost's obligation. Then why let me try? She asked, her voice breaking. His answer was simple, the kind that rooted itself deep. Because trying means this land can become yours, too. Her throat tightened, the bucket heavy in her grip. He was offering her a home, not because he wanted her, but because his dead brother had. And as she looked around at the dusty corral, the weary cattle, the silent, watching men, she realized something else. This place was dying. The fences were in disrepair. The cattle were thin. The laughter of the men wasn't just cruel. It was the sound of desperate people on a failing ranch. His kindness wasn't just about her. It was a desperate attempt to hold on to the last pieces of his brother's dream, even as it crumbled to dust around him. And she was just another crumbling piece. The sun set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. Dusk settled over the ranch, and with it, a stillness that felt like a held breath. Her hands shook so violently as she untied the apron that she nearly tore the strings. When it slipped from her waist, she clutched it to her chest. The tears she had held back all day finally spilled, hot and silent, down her cheeks. I'll never be what they expect, she whispered, her voice cracking in the quiet of the porch. The honesty of it startled her more than the sound of her own weeping. I burn bread, I stumble with buckets, I speak with a trembling tongue. I am the shadow of a dead man's hope. I am not fit for this place, and I never will be. The words poured out like a dam breaking, years of being measured and found wanting, rushing into the night. Her knees bent as if the weight of them alone might drag her to the floor. Elias stepped from the yard into the porch light. His boots were steady against the planks, and his shadow stretched across her as he stopped before her. His voice was low, certain. You don't have to be what they expect, he said. You only have to be who you are. She shook her head fiercely, pressing the apron harder against her chest until her fingers ached. And what if who I am is not enough? She cried, her tears falling onto the cloth. What if I'm not enough to save this ranch? The question hung in the air, raw and unexpected. It wasn't just about her fitting in. It was about the truth she'd seen in the weary faces and broken fences. The ranch was failing, and Samuel's marriage to her. It must have been about more than just finding a wife. It must have been about survival. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her eye level. For the first time, his expression softened into something almost raw. He looked surprised. How did you know? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I see it, she said, her sobs subsiding into ragged breaths. In the faces of the men, in the wood of the barn. This place is grieving too. He looked away, toward the dark outline of the hills. Samuel's letters. The bargain with your family. It included a dowry. Enough to see us through 2 more seasons. Enough to rebuild. Of course, it was always a bargain. She was a parcel, bought and paid for, not with love, but with the promise of salvation for this dying land. And now, with Samuel gone, the bargain was void. She had arrived with nothing, a bride with no groom and no dowry. She was not just a curse. She was a broken promise, the final nail in the coffin of his brother's legacy. Then I am less than nothing, she whispered, the last of her fight draining away. He reached out and took her hand. His was rough, calloused, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. No, he said, his voice fierce, pulling her gaze back to his. You're not. He stood, pulling her to her feet. You're right. This ranch is dying. My brother is gone, and I am failing him. He let go of her hand and took the apron from her, his movements deliberate. But you are still standing here. You haven't run. You saw the truth of this place, and you didn't run. He held the apron, not as a symbol of her failure, but as something else. A banner. What if who you are, he said, his eyes locking with hers, a strange new light in them, is exactly what this place needs. Love, the old stories say, is not the absence of weakness, but the vow to bear it together. Her breath shuddered in her chest. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no duty. There was something else. A flicker of respect. A spark of an idea. And for the first time she felt not the weight of his grief, but the startling possibility of a shared fight. Her fingers loosened on the apron, and though no words left her lips, the silence between them carried the first fragile promise, not of love, but of alliance. An alliance forged in ruin, on the edge of collapse. An alliance that might be even more dangerous than love itself. The long table stretched beneath the glow of hanging lamps. The low rumble of voices filled the ranch hall as the workers gathered for supper. The air was heavy with the smell of beans and cheap stew, the smell of scarcity. She stood at the end of the table, the apron tied neatly at her waist. Her eyes darted nervously as the men leaned in close, whispering. Their words were audible this time. A bride with no dowry. Bad luck is what she is. Came for a dead man's land. The words were stones hurled across the room. Laughter broke now and again, sharp and cutting. Each sound pressed her further into herself. Elias entered last, his stride steady. He took his place at the head of the table. His presence shifted the air instantly. Conversations dipped, but the tension lingered, thick and suffocating. She carried a plate forward, hands trembling, and set it before him. The memory of burned bread, of a dead brother, of a failed bargain, hung between them. One of the men, the loud one from before, a man named Jess, muttered loud enough for all to hear. "Careful, boss. That plate's as empty as her promises." A few chuckles followed, quick and cruel. Her throat closed. She felt the eyes of every man on her, judging her, weighing her, and finding her worthless. Cruelty often hunts in packs, feeding on laughter, but a single word of mercy can scatter them like wolves before fire. Elias looked down the long table, his eyes calm, but burning. He didn't pick up his fork. He just watched the men. "Jess," he said, his voice even, "you've been with this ranch for 10 years. "Yes, sir," Jess said, puffing out his chest a little. "And in those 10 years," Elias continued, his voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet, "your wages have been paid on time, every time." "Yes, sir," Jess said again, a little less certain now. "That's because for 10 years my father, and then my brother and I, have poured our blood into this dirt to make it so," Elias said, his voice rising now, sharp as steel. "We have taken on debt. We have sold off our own stock. We have gone hungry so that you could eat." The hall was silent. Forks froze. Chuckles died. "This woman," Elias said, turning his gaze to her, and his voice softened, but only for a moment, "came here believing in a promise my brother made, a promise this land made." He looked back at the men, and his eyes were blazing. "This land is failing. That is not her fault. It is mine. The shame is mine to bear." He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "But she is not shame," he said, his voice echoing against the timber walls. "She is my wife!" Gasps slipped through the hall. Not because they believed it was a marriage of love, but because in the West, a man's word was often sharper than his gun. And when he claimed something in front of witnesses, it was a vow that could not be undone. He wasn't just defending her, he was binding her to him, binding her to this failing ranch. He was tying her to a sinking ship. Her tears fell freely then, not from humiliation, not from gratitude, but from terror. He had just trapped her. He had just chained her to his own failure, using the word wife as the lock. She clutched the apron tighter, her knees trembling. "You can't mean that," she whispered, broken by the public declaration that felt more like a sentence than a salvation. His lips curved into the faintest smile, not soft, but unyielding. "I mean it more than breath," he said for all to hear. "You are my choice." The hall fell into a silence so complete that even the creak of the lamps above seemed hushed. The ranch hands lowered their eyes, some in shame, some in quiet awe, some in calculation. Jess, the loudmouth, looked pale. Her chest ached with the force of it. Her heart clawed against the cage of his words. This wasn't a rescue. It was a takeover. He was claiming her, the last asset tied to his brother, in a desperate public gamble. But to what end? Why chain himself to another liability? Unless she wasn't a liability. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they were respected. Her signature on a letter to them pleading for a loan. It might carry weight. It might be the only thing that could convince them to send the money that was supposed to be her dowry. He hadn't saved her. He was using her. Her tears stopped. A cold, hard resolve settled in her heart. He thought he had trapped her. He thought he had made her his pawn. But even a pawn on the right square could become a queen. The hall emptied slowly. The men slipped out into the night one by one, their glances now a mixture of fear and respect for the man who had just laid down an unbreakable law. Only she and Elias remained, the glow of the lamps pooling around them. She stood frozen at the far end of the table, the apron twisted in her hands. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations and cold fury. At last, her voice broke the silence, not trembling, but sharp and clear. That was a lie. He didn't flinch. He walked the length of the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, until he stood before her. "Which part?" he asked, his voice low. "The part where you called me your wife," she said, her eyes meeting his without fear. "The part where you called me your choice. I am not your choice. I am your last chance. You want me to write to my family. You want the dowry." He reached out, not to comfort, but to gently unfold the apron from her fists, smoothing its wrinkled cloth as he had done before. But this time, the gesture was not gentle. It was possessive. "You were never nothing," he said softly, his voice certain as stone. "And tonight, you became mine. Not because of letters, not because of bargains, but because I saw you, and I chose you." He met her gaze, and there was no deceit in his eyes, only a terrifying sincerity. "The dowry is gone. Your family sent word a week ago. With Samuel's death, the contract was void. There is no money, Clara." Her breath caught. The ground she thought she'd found, the one piece of leverage she thought she held, crumbled into dust. There was no dowry. There was no last chance. So why? Why would he tie himself to her, a penniless bride on a bankrupt ranch? It made no sense. Unless he was a fool, or unless the truth was something far more complicated. He lifted the apron and tied it around her waist again. His hands lingered for a heartbeat, gentle but sure. "This isn't a chain," he said quietly. "It's a promise. You belong here, not as a servant, not as a pawn, as my wife." A sob slipped from her throat, laced with confusion. "Why?" she whispered, the fight gone out of her. "Why do this? Why doom yourself?" He reached up and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was warm, real. "Because my brother loved you," he said simply. "I read his letters to you, and his journal. He chose you not for your dowry, but for your spirit. He believed you could make this place bloom." Elias took a step back, his eyes searching hers. "And because I think he was right." He placed a piece of the broken bread from his plate into her hand. She closed her fingers around it as if it were treasure. "This ranch is going to die, Clara," he said, his voice raw with a pain that went deeper than debt. "Jess and the others. They're not just cruel, they're scared. They're loyal to a man named Silas Croft, who holds the note on this land. He wants it. He's been waiting for us to fail. Silas Croft. Another name, another shadow. He's been squeezing us for years," Elias continued, his voice tight with anger. "And I've heard whispers. Fences cut, water holes fouled, small things, accidents, but they're not. Croft is pushing us over the edge." Now it made sense. The men's fear, the desperation. Jess wasn't just a bully, he was a spy. Elias had not claimed her as a pawn. He had claimed her as a partner. He hadn't trapped her. He had stood in front of his enemies and declared her his ally, the one person on this ranch he could trust, because she was the only one with nothing to gain from its failure. She looked up at him, her tears shimmering in the lamplight. She whispered the words she had feared she would never say, but they tasted different now, not of surrender, but of a beginning. "Then I choose you too." His arms wrapped around her, strong and certain. She felt herself steady for the first time since leaving home, as though the walls themselves had been built to shelter her. Outside, the wind shifted across the plains, carrying the scent of smoke and bread. And in that humble kitchen, the two of them began not a love story, but a war. A war for a dying ranch, for a brother's memory, and for a home that was already under siege. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Now let me ask you, if you were in her shoes, would you trust the man who bound you to a failing ranch, or would you see it as just another cage? Let me know in the comments below.